Hello, everybody, and welcome to this evening's reading, which is from a novel entitled Another Kind of Life. And first of all, thank you to people who contacted me through my website, curious about the content and the genesis of this particular novel. I've called it a novel based in history as opposed to a historical novel. And I think the difference is that historical novels focus on illuminating the history of the time, and the characters are, in a way, incidental because it's the major events in history which are the real focus of the writing. For me, on the other hand, my focus in this book, Another Kind of Life, was on the people and the history. The historical background is simply like a tapestry to their lives, if you like, the colour and the texture which highlight what the different characters are going through. So the inspiration for this novel actually came from a photograph. It came from seeing my paternal grandmother, seeing a photograph of her wedding where she was wearing the most astonishing hat, something large enough to need its own landing strip, I think. And so the cover that was chosen for the novel, 15 or more years ago now, was this. And the history, or the story rather, of my grandmother was that she was married at quite a young age to my grandfather in Belfast, who was a great deal older than she was. So I've told the stories of the sectarian history of Belfast, really, and the contrast with Dublin. I've told the story through two different sets of sisters. My grandmother, whom I call Hannah, and obviously this is very loosely based on her life, Hannah and Hannah and her sisters, with apologies to our filmmaker friend. And then the sisters Mary and Cecilia. And Mary and Cecilia are completely invented characters. However, Mary ends up as a maid in the house of my grandmother Hannah. And my grandmother did actually have a maid called Mary, whom my father remembered very fondly. I know nothing about Mary and nothing about her history, so I had to invent everything. So two groups of sisters, if you like, Hannah and her sisters, and then Mary and Cecilia. So the research was fascinating. I spent a lot of time in the Linen Hall Library in Belfast, where the librarians were incredibly patient and helpful. And I learned a lot about Belfast starting in the late 1890s, and the novel moves up to 1904, 1905, there or thereabouts. So the first extract is about Mary and Cecilia, and they were two sisters born into a very working class family, a very poor family in a poor part of Belfast called Carrick Hill. And the two girls are Catholic, but they work in one of the mills owned by Watson, Valentine and Company. And the previous day, just before this extract, the previous day, what had happened to them was that they were the victims of a sectarian attack on their way home from work, something which unfortunately was all too common. So this is the following day, and it's Mary and Cecilia in spring, 1893. Mary rose later than normal the following morning. The peal of church bells for 7 o'clock mass sounded louder than usual, their call harsh and jangling in the brittle morning air. She left Cecilia sleeping and went downstairs to make her breakfast. She was glad it was Sunday, that she didn't have to face Watson and Valentine's today. Her whole body hurt, every muscle stretched, taut and aching. She felt that everything about her was suddenly fragile. Her spirit was all but broken, her optimism exhausted. She hated the thought of tomorrow, of facing yet again the tense tram ride, another taunting mob, the almost certainty of more trouble on the streets. And yet she couldn't afford not to go to work. The walls of her small life seemed to be closing in on her. She felt that it was becoming difficult to breathe. She was the older one. It was up to her to make the best of what had happened to them, what was likely to happen again in the long, uncertain days ahead. She had slept badly, wondering how they were going to manage if Cecilia could not go back to spinning. They couldn't stay here. Not that she wanted to stay here, but for now she had nowhere else to go, no other means of earning a living. She thought about Miles. He would marry her, she knew that, and he would help look after Cecilia, have her to live with them along with his ailing mother. She didn't even need to discuss it with him. That was how they would do things, he and she. That was how it was. She could see her whole married life stretch out in front of her, its sameness as assured as the streets she lived in. They would not go far. Carrickhill, children, middle age, daughters to the mill as half-timers if they were unlucky. The same old vicious circle all over again. Or if they were lucky, to school until 14, followed by some gentler employment. Their sons would go to the rope works, to the water plants, to the angers and resentments of Harland and Wolff, always second class, always poor. She would never get out, never breathe fresh air and see her children play in open fields by the sea, somewhere healthy and happy. And Cecilia, what chance did her health have here? She'd probably be dead before she was 40. Ironically, having escaped the certainty of consumption, to be cut down by the constant assault of ill health on a body already weakened by brutality and infection. Mary cut a large hunk of bread while waiting for the water to boil. She made the tea as strong as she could and carried the 2 mugs back upstairs to the bedroom. Cecilia was awake. Her eyes followed her sister hugely around the bedroom. Mary put the mugs down on the floor. She stroked her sister's forehead, taking care not to touch any of the cuts and scratches that were now darker than yesterday, congealed blood thickening at the edges. Her whole face seemed to be one massive bruise, the skin a deep, angry vermilion. Her lips were split, her cheeks swollen, puffy. Even her neck was discoloured, the skin from chin to collarbone red and inflamed. Mary was frightened at the heat from her sister's forehead. She was burning up. She prayed silently that the doctor would hurry. Cecilia smiled up at her as best she could. Some of her teeth were missing, others broken, blackened with dried blood. How are you feeling, love? The younger girl barely nodded in reply. Mary knelt on the floor beside the bed, as close to Cecilia as she could. I've brought you tea. Maybe if I soak the bread in it, you might be able to eat a wee bit. Cecilia shook her head. Dr. Torrance is going to look in on you this morning. Mary tried to keep her voice light, but her sister's face, the blankness of her eyes, the sweaty, angry skin, terrified her. She had a strong sense that Cecilia's injuries were even worse than they looked. What if she lost the sight of her poor eyes? Cecilia squeezed her sister's hand. She tried to speak and winced. Don't try to say nothing. You have another wee sleep there. I'm going downstairs to wait for the doctor. Cecilia's eyes closed. Mary wondered how it could be possible to sleep when you were in so much pain. Her eyes filled as she thought of her mother. She needed Ma now. She couldn't look after Cecilia without her. She was afraid of what might happen, being on her own. She went downstairs again to the kitchen, balancing her mug of tea carefully. She couldn't eat the bread she had cut. Its taste was stale, almost powdery. She put it aside and went to all her hiding places around the kitchen. Ma had taught her to put away whatever money could be spared, no matter how little, for a rainy day. Mary used to watch her as a child, making a game out of hiding pennies, threepenny bits, the odd sixpence. She and Mary would be the only ones to share the secret. As Mary moved about the kitchen now, opening canisters, prizing the old lids off metal boxes, she felt an unfamiliar surge of bitterness. She remembered how she promised herself that she would have another kind of life. Mary knew that her mother's death had been hastened not just by her own years at the mill and the wasting disease which seemed to come to all sooner or later. More than that, she had become consumed by despair, watching with enormous pool black eyes as her two daughters became trapped, just as she had been. Mary had heard her mother's anguish during the long nights of her illness. Often she'd crept into Ma's bedroom and into the cold bed beside her. From those nights, Mary knew that her mother's tears were not for herself, but for the daughters she had had such hopes for. Cecilia was the bookish one, so quick and clever at her sums, at reading. Ma had been angry at God, had shaken her fist at him in the darkness. Of all of them, Cecilia should have been able to stay at school, to better herself, to pull herself out of the pit of Carrickhill. Ma had always believed that a better life awaited her daughters, better than she had had, somewhere way beyond the mills of Watson, Ballantyne and company. She used to have hot, heady dreams about the mill being like a giant spider web, winding its flaxen threads around her daughters' waists, holding on tight, pulling them closer into its remorseless centre. And she never stopped missing her three sons. Life was good in America, it seemed, and the work plentiful. Father McVeigh had tried to get in touch with them for her after their father died, but there had been no response. Not known here, no forwarding address. They'd moved on by then, maybe, or maybe they just didn't want to know. It happened. People here shrugged it off as though such abandonment was natural, only to be expected. Sometimes parcels kept coming from America for years, dressing and entertaining the younger ones in the large families left behind. More often they stopped after a year or two, to be replaced by the few dollars at Christmas time, inserted between sheets of writing paper, folded carefully into blue envelopes with exotic stamps. Eventually, inevitably, these stopped too. People made new families, created new memories, a whole new way of life. That's the way of the world, child, one of Ma's favourite sayings. Nevertheless, Mary could always tell that it had scalded her heart. She kept rummaging around the kitchen now for almost half an hour, looking twice or three times in the same places, dismayed at the paltry yield. A handful of copper pennies, a sixpence, a couple of halfpennies. That would pay no doctor. He was a kind man, Mary knew, and that made it all the more important to be able to give him something. She hated relying on charity. She spread her arms out on the tiny table and rested her forehead on them. Her whole head felt heavy. It was an effort to hold it up. At least this escape cost her nothing. She would sleep until he arrived. And now the second extract was my imagination about how my grandmother and Mary might have met. And it all comes back to the hat that I imagined and that started the whole story going. The violent gust of wind which suddenly wrenched the open door from her grasp took Hannah completely by surprise. She lunged forward, trying to catch it before it slammed shut. She had no choice. She let go of her hat and hat pin, expecting both of them to land safely at her feet in the porch. Instead, her hat seemed to become possessed of a mind of its own. With some initial difficulty in finding its balance, it took sudden, gleeful flight and lurched rapidly all the way down the garden path, taking to the air as soon as it reached the main road outside. All Hannah could manage was a surprised, "Oh." She was disappointed. She'd really liked that hat. She was just about to say something when, without a word, the young woman, whose name was Mary, she in the workaday boots, literally took off after it, chasing the flimsy mix of straw and ribbons for all she was worth, driving rain and strong winds notwithstanding. Hannah wanted to call out after her to get her to stop. She cut a most comical figure, holding on to her skirts, sticking out first one foot, then the other, as though dancing to some mad tune inside her head. Mary tried again and again to trap the unruly hat, only to be defeated as it took flight again, feathers fluttering everywhere like small demented birds, and off she went once more in apparently useless pursuit. Hannah couldn't help laughing. Then, to her surprise, she saw the girl stop suddenly, her foot planted solidly beneath her. She bent down, and there was something triumphant about her as she stood upright, her hat held firmly now between her two hands. Hannah thought she could see her grinning to herself. At that moment, she liked her immensely. She didn't care what secrets Miss Mulqueen's character reference might reveal. She would have this girl, Mary, in her house. Anybody that determined deserved a chance. It took only a few moments for the young woman to arrive, breathless, at Hannah's side, holding out the hat like some sort of tattered peace offering. Okay, that's it for this evening. Please continue to contact me if you wish through my website, and any emails which I can't answer personally, although I do my best, I'll certainly address them in the next reading, which, in collaboration with the holding cell, will be next Tuesday at 7:30. Have a lovely Easter, everyone, although it'll be a very different one. But nevertheless, stay well, stay safe, and stay home. Bye for now.